dust was thick that morning, hanging in the scorching air and mixing with the stench of 10,000 unwashed men who had marched for 1,000 miles without rest. Death pressed in from every direction. Behind them lay starvation, sickness, and the long trail of corpses left by the Third Crusade's brutal overland march. Around them, hidden in the hills and gullies, the Turks circled like wolves waiting for the moment to strike. And ahead of them, blocking the only road to salvation, rose the fortified city of Iconium, the heart of Seljuk power in Anatolia. Yet within mere hours, something utterly impossible would unfold, something that would echo through the annals of medieval warfare. To understand how this moment came to be, we must go back 3 weeks, when Emperor Frederick Barbarossa made a decision so bold that even his most loyal commanders doubted him. It was May of 1190, and the Third Crusade, one of the largest military coalitions in medieval history, was fully underway. While Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus chose the safety of the sea route, Barbarossa, already a living legend at the age of 68, chose to lead his forces overland, directly through hostile Turkish territory. They called him the Redbeard, and for 40 years he had carved his name into Europe through sheer martial brilliance. Yet here he was again, leading an enormous crusader army into the very jaws of the Seljuk Sultanate. His opponent was Sultan Kilij Arslan II, known as the Lion Sword, master of the Turkish style of war. For 2 decades, he had ruled the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum with an iron hand, dominating Anatolia and refining the tactics of horse archery and mobile warfare that had humbled so many Christian armies before. His cavalry moved like smoke across the plains, striking suddenly and disappearing into the heat haze. No Western army had crossed his lands in living memory, but Barbarossa had outlived and outthought enemies for 40 years because he saw what others missed. While younger commanders trembled at the speed and accuracy of the Turkish horse archers, Barbarossa saw patterns. The Seljuks relied on mobility and missiles. They avoided direct combat with heavily armored knights. Their confidence had hardened into arrogance. They believed no army of the West could endure the burning furnace of Anatolia long enough to threaten their strongholds. The Crusader march through Anatolia had become a nightmare carved into the men's memory. They had begun with nearly 100,000. Now, disease, desertion, heat, poisoned wells, burned food stores, and endless Turkish ambushes had cut that number to barely 15,000. Every mile cost lives. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion inside their armor. Horses died by the hundreds. Arrows appeared from nowhere. Drums and horns tormented them at night as raids tore through the camps. Yet through all of this, Barbarossa pressed forward with the cold patience of a man who had seen too much war to be intimidated. His subordinates begged him to turn back. The Duke of Swabia argued for retreat. The Bishop of Würzburg prayed for divine rescue, but Barbarossa saw something none of them dared to imagine. The Turks were predictable. They fought exactly as their fathers and grandfathers had fought. They had not adapted to the new discipline and concentrated power of Western heavy cavalry, nor to the stubborn resolve of the emperor's battle-hardened infantry. Iconium, the Seljuk capital, rose ahead like a promise and a threat. Its triple walls had never been breached. 5,000 troops guarded it. Its position controlled the only viable passage towards Syria and the Holy Land. If Barbarossa could take Iconium, he would shatter Seljuk power in a single stroke. But the Sultan made a mistake. Instead of concentrating his forces inside the city, he divided them. One contingent sheltered within Iconium. Another shadowed the Crusader column. The largest waited to deliver the killing blow once the Christians were fully exhausted. Kilij Arslan believed time itself was his ally. He would let the Europeans break their strength on Iconium's walls, and then his 40,000 cavalry would annihilate the survivors. What he did not understand was that Barbarossa had spent 3 weeks watching, waiting, and planning with the precision of a master strategist. His knights still possessed their heaviest armor. His infantry, though ragged and weary, maintained discipline. And most importantly, Barbarossa had discovered the Seljuks' fatal weakness: their overconfidence and their absolute inability to imagine that a starving, exhausted Western army might choose to attack rather than defend. As dawn approached, messengers arrived with grim news. The Sultan's main army, 40,000 strong, fresh, fast, and confident, was closing in. The Crusaders were now trapped between the fortified city and the advancing host. Any ordinary commander would have ordered an immediate retreat or prepared for a desperate last stand. But Barbarossa, with his 4 decades of hardened intuition, saw a third option, the most dangerous of all. He would not retreat. He would not cower behind shields. He would attack, and in a single day, on the plains before Iconium, he would show the world why the Iron Men of the West had been feared from the Rhine to the Holy Land. Dawn broke on May 17th, and Frederick Barbarossa looked upon his army with a cold, calculating gaze. Only 10,000 men remained fully capable of fighting. Of the proud hosts that once marched from Europe, only 2,000 knights still had war horses, and many of those animals were little more than gaunt skeletons wrapped in hide. 8,000 infantry stood ready, exhausted, yet clinging stubbornly to their weapons. They had lost 5,000 comrades just to reach Iconium, and those who remained were the toughest, most unbreakable warriors Christendom could produce. His commanders formed a living tapestry of German nobility. Duke Frederick VI of Swabia, the emperor's own son, commanded the vanguard with the fiery determination of youth sharpened by his father's guidance. Count Robert of Nassau, veteran of countless campaigns, led the Rhineland contingent. Markward of Anweiler commanded the emperor's personal guard, 500 men sworn to die before they allowed harm to touch Barbarossa. Each leader brought invaluable expertise: siege warfare, cavalry tactics, infantry discipline. But even with such men, the odds were monstrous. Inside Iconium, 5,000 troops manned the triple walls that had never once fallen. The defenses rose 30 feet high, 10 feet thick, studded with towers, stocked with Greek fire, and fortified by months of supplies. Gates reinforced with iron could withstand any battering. Meanwhile, from the east, the Sultan approached with his host. 40,000 warriors, perhaps more by some accounts, sweeping forward in glittering ranks. 20,000 were elite cavalry archers, each warrior armed with 2 bows and 150 arrows. They were not mere soldiers, but lifelong horsemen capable of firing a dozen arrows per minute while galloping at full speed. 15,000 infantry formed the backbone of the force, with another 5,000 Turkmen irregulars hungry for plunder. The Sultan exuded confidence. His scouts had reported the Crusaders' condition accurately: starving, exhausted, horses collapsing daily, fighting under a burning Anatolian sun that reached 95 degrees. To Turkish commanders, the situation was almost comical. What could a mere 10,000 worn-out men possibly do against fresh armies and impregnable walls? Yet hidden among Barbarossa's ranks was something the Seljuks had never faced at full strength: disciplined heavy cavalry operating in absolute coordination. Every knight represented decades of training. Every surviving destrier cost more than most villages. When grouped into a concentrated formation, 2,000 armored knights could strike with the force of a modern armored division. Then Barbarossa made a decision that stunned even his most loyal commanders. On the evening of May 17th, he divided his forces. The idea was madness. Any commander taught by the rules of war would warn that splitting an already inferior force invited immediate destruction. Duke Frederick argued to keep the army united. Count Robert suggested negotiation. But Barbarossa had survived 40 years by understanding a simple truth. Sometimes boldness accomplishes what caution never could. His plan bordered on insanity, yet it was breathtaking in its elegance. Duke Frederick would take 3,000 men, including 700 knights, and march directly toward Iconium's gates. The garrison, seeing such a small force daring to approach, would almost certainly sally out to destroy them. Meanwhile, Barbarossa would hold the remaining 7,000 against the Sultan's oncoming army. Both detachments were outnumbered more than 5 to 1. By every calculation, they should be overwhelmed and annihilated. Night fell, and the air thrummed with tension. Turkish riders circled beyond crossbow range, taunting the exhausted crusaders, mocking their faith, their hunger, their imminent deaths. Banners captured from earlier skirmishes were displayed with cruel laughter. Some crusaders wavered, morale cracking under the relentless pressure. But then Barbarossa rode through the ranks. Even at 68, he cut a towering figure, calm and steady as an iron pillar. His presence alone restored discipline. "Tomorrow," he said, "we remind them why their grandfathers feared the iron men of the West." His voice carried across the camp like a spark in dry grass, igniting courage in men who had marched to hell and refused to die there. That night, the priests held mass, and the knights confessed their sins. Infantry sharpened weapons with grim determination. Inside the command tent, Barbarossa refined his plan, adjusting every detail. Timing would be everything. Duke Frederick had to strike the gates at precisely the right moment. Too early, and the garrison would fall back inside. Too late, and Barbarossa's main force would be swallowed by the Sultan's host. What the Turks did not know was that Barbarossa had hidden one more secret. His best knights, the 500 men of the Imperial Guard, remained fresh. Their horses fed with rations secretly stored at the expense of the infantry. Their armor gleamed even after the terrible march. These were the men capable of forming the dreaded Iron Wedge, a formation so devastating that no Eastern army had ever faced it in full. At dawn on May 18th, the two Crusader columns separated beneath the pale morning light. Duke Frederick led his 3,000 directly toward Iconium, making no attempt at concealment. Turkish sentries scoffed. To them, this was not bravery. It was suicide. Meanwhile, Barbarossa arrayed his 7,000 on a small rise 2 miles from the city, his formation deliberately thin, weak-looking, inviting attack. Turkish scouts reported exactly what Barbarossa wanted them to see: an exhausted army preparing for a hopeless last stand. The first arrows fell as the sun crested the horizon. Turkish cavalry archers swept forward in massive crescent formations, releasing black clouds of arrows that darkened the sky. Yet the Crusaders did not retreat. They lifted their shields in unison, forming overlapping barriers forged through years of discipline. Losses were minimal. By mid-morning, Duke Frederick reached Iconium's walls. The garrison commander paused. 3,000 tired crusaders could not possibly threaten his fortress, but ignoring them risked allowing siege preparations. Pride won. The gates swung open, and 2,000 garrison cavalry thundered forth, eager to crush the invaders. But Frederick had prepared his men well. Infantry formed spear-bristling squares. Crossbowmen targeted the lighter Turkish horses. The 700 knights waited like coiled iron springs. When the Turkish cavalry slammed into them expecting panic, they found only disciplined resistance. The garrison's confidence faltered. Meanwhile, at the main battlefield, Barbarossa had begun orchestrating his masterpiece. Arrows rained down, horses stumbled, the Turks pressed harder, sensing weakness. Dust clouds on the horizon signaled the arrival of the Sultan's main army. Turkish war cries rolled across the plain like thunder. 30,000 arrows fell within minutes. The Crusader line bent but did not break. It was exactly what Barbarossa wanted. The Turks pressed too close. Their horses pushed into tight clusters. Their mobility, so vital to their strategy, evaporated. The Seljuks had been drawn into the killing ground. At high noon, Barbarossa raised his arm. Trumpets blared. The Crusader center split open like a gate. From within surged 500 fresh knights, thundering down the slope in the iron wedge. Their armor gleamed. Their destriers roared beneath them. A moving wall of steel and flesh, perfectly disciplined after years of training, tore through the Turkish lines. And suddenly, in a single explosive moment, the entire Seljuk strategy collapsed. The iron wedge hurled forward with unstoppable force, its triangular shape cutting through the Turkish ranks like a plow cleaving hardened earth. 500 knights, each encased in steel and mounted on massive destriers, accelerated down the gentle slope with terrifying precision. To the Seljuks, who had grown accustomed to lightly armored foes collapsing under a hail of arrows, this sight was unlike anything they had ever faced. At 30 miles per hour, each knight carried the kinetic force of a charging war machine, and together they formed a living avalanche. The Sultan, watching from his command hill, felt the first cold stab of fear. These were not exhausted remnants. These were not dying men clinging to their last breath. These were fresh, thundering instruments of destruction, unleashed at the perfect moment. His cavalry archers, packed tightly from overconfidence and proximity, had nowhere to flee. Horsemen who once danced around their enemies with ease found themselves trapped, boxed in by their own advance. Arrows launched at hurried angles clattered harmlessly off shields and armor. The wedge gained speed, the ground shaking beneath thousands of hooves. The front ranks of Turkish cavalry froze between instinct and discipline, torn between running and holding their ground. In the end, it made no difference. The moment of impact was catastrophic. The point of the wedge, led by Markward of Anweiler and several of Barbarossa's most elite guards, smashed headlong into the Turkish center. Lances splintered on impact, impaling horse and rider alike. Light mail tore apart beneath the weight of plunging steel. Those not struck directly were crushed under the mass of bodies as destriers barreled forward with unrelenting momentum. Horses screamed. Men vanished under armored hooves. Entire ranks simply ceased to exist in a heartbeat. For 7 seconds, an eternity and yet a moment, the Sultan's elite guards attempted to brace themselves. These were hardened warriors, trained to die at their lord's command, and they planted their spears in desperate defiance. Spears splintered, shields cracked. The iron wedge hit them like an avalanche ripping through a thin line of saplings. Their sacrifice only made the collapse more violent. The wedge punched through the center, leaving a gaping wound in the Seljuk formation. Behind the breach, chaos exploded. Units that had once seemed timeless and disciplined now panicked, scattering in all directions. When the Sultan's green banner dipped for the first time, a wave of dread swept through his troops. When it fell, trampled under Crusader hooves moments later, their morale shattered completely. Cries spread through the Turkish ranks. "Allah has abandoned us!" Thousands broke formation and fled. Others simply threw down their weapons and ran. The Sultan, understanding that the battle was lost, turned his horse and raced eastward, abandoning the field, his men, and the city behind him. But Barbarossa was far from finished. His order was merciless, no quarter. The Crusaders, enraged by weeks of torment, starvation, and constant harassment, unleashed their fury. Knights rode down fleeing horsemen as if hunting game. Infantry advanced methodically, cutting down the wounded and those who begged for mercy. The Turks had shown none during the march, and now the Crusaders returned every cruelty tenfold. And then, fate delivered a final, devastating twist. As the Seljuk army broke apart and streamed back toward Iconium, Duke Frederick's forces burst through the city's eastern gate. For hours they had fought street by street, pushing deeper into the city. Fires raged from overturned braziers. Civilians fled in terror. Garrison troops attempted to form new lines of defense, but the narrow streets worked against them. When Frederick's men fought their way toward the central market, they collided with a fresh wave of Turkish soldiers returning from the battlefield, soldiers who believed the city still held. Instead, they ran headlong into Crusaders pouring through the ruins. The fleeing Turkish warriors, desperate to reach safety behind the walls, found those same walls vomiting forth Christian knights drenched in the blood of their comrades. They were trapped, caught between Frederick's steel on one side and Barbarossa's pursuing cavalry on the other. Panic turned into slaughter. What followed defied belief. The field between Iconium's gates and the open plain became a killing ground. Thousands of Turks, with nowhere left to run, were cut down in merciless sequence. Bodies piled so high that they formed grisly barriers. Blood turned the dry Anatolian soil into red mud. Chroniclers struggled to describe the carnage. Some claimed 9,000 Turks died. Others insisted 20,000. A few wrote that 40,000 perished in those 6 hours. Whatever the true number, it was one of the most decisive massacres in medieval military history. Inside Iconium, the last pockets of resistance collapsed. The Sultan's younger brother retreated into the citadel, barring the gates behind him while the city burned. The rest of Iconium fell to looting. Crusaders who had survived on handfuls of dates and stagnant water now gorged on warehouses full of grain, spices, and wine. The legendary treasury of the Sultanate of Rum, gold, silver, silks, and weapons, was seized within hours. When the fires calmed and the screams faded, Barbarossa and his son met in the charred ruins near the palace. The old emperor, armor splashed with the blood of friend and foe alike, embraced the young duke. Witnesses reported tears on the faces of men who had followed Barbarossa across continents. Against all odds, they had survived the impossible. They had defeated an army 4 times their size. They had taken the untalkable city, and for the moment, it seemed nothing could stop them. When dawn approached on May 19th, the scale of the Turkish catastrophe could no longer be concealed behind smoke or pride. The Sultan's younger brother still held out within the citadel, watching helplessly as Iconium smoldered beneath him. The once proud capital of the Sultanate of Rum, unbreached for generations, was now under Christian control. Outside its walls, tens of thousands of Turkish dead lay strewn across the plains, and vultures already circled above the carnage. Barbarossa, having achieved a victory so complete that even the Crusaders struggled to comprehend it, now prepared for whatever came next. Inside the citadel, with no hope of rescue and no army left to command, Sultan Kilij Arslan II finally surrendered. Under a flag of truce, he emerged humbled and broken, offering gold, noble hostages, fresh supplies, guides for the road ahead, and anything else the Crusaders demanded. The terms were rich: 100,000 gold bezants, hundreds of noble hostages, abundant grain and livestock for the march, and safe passage eastward. Barbarossa accepted. He did not need the Sultan's throne or corpse. He had already won the war he came to fight. The psychological impact of Iconium spread like wildfire across the Islamic world. The Seljuk cavalry, once considered unstoppable, had been crushed. The city believed to be impregnable had fallen in a single day. From Damascus to Mosul, from Aleppo to Cairo, leaders and generals whispered the same thought with troubled curiosity. The Franks were not relics gasping their last breath. They were still capable of monstrous, overwhelming violence when led by a commander of genius. For Barbarossa personally, Iconium was his masterpiece. It was the perfect union of audacity, discipline, terrain, timing, and psychological warfare. Modern military historians still study the battle as a model of operational brilliance. He took an army that should have collapsed and turned it into a weapon sharper than any sword. He lured the Turks into overconfidence, manipulated the terrain to his advantage, and struck at the precise moment when the enemy's strength became their weakness. He divided his army when logic demanded otherwise, and forced the enemy to fight in a way they never expected. In a single 6-hour span, he destroyed the Seljuk field army, smashed the garrison of their capital, and took the city that symbolized their power. But history is cruel in its irony. 22 days later, the greatest military mind of the age would meet a fate so absurd that chroniclers struggled to record it without disbelief. On June 10, 1190, as the Crusader army trekked through the rugged landscape of Armenia, they came upon the Salif River. It was not deep. It was not wide. It was not dangerous. Some men walked across with water barely reaching their waists. Yet, as Barbarossa attempted to ford the river, some accounts say his horse slipped, others say he sought to cool himself after the oppressive heat. He fell into the water. The weight of his armor dragged him down. Before anyone could reach him, Frederick Barbarossa, the Iron Emperor, drowned. The shock rippled instantly through the army. Men who had faced death for months without blinking now broke into tears. Some tore their garments. Others collapsed to their knees. The living legend who had led them through every hardship, who had defied all odds at Iconium, who had carried their hopes of reclaiming the Holy Land, was gone in a single, meaningless moment. Without Barbarossa's leadership, the Crusader host dissolved. Many knights returned home. Others died on the road. Only a small remnant eventually reached the Holy Land. And without the great emperor, the Third Crusade took a different path. Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus became the chronicled heroes of that crusade. But neither achieved the kind of decisive victory the world believed Barbarossa might have secured. Had he lived to reach the walls of Jerusalem with his disciplined veterans, history might have unfolded very differently. Yet his final triumph, Iconium, remained immortal. Even centuries later, the battle is cited as a turning point in medieval warfare. It demonstrated beyond all doubt the devastating power of disciplined, heavy cavalry. It proved that superior tactics, leadership, and morale could shatter numerical superiority. It showed the world that an aging emperor could still outthink and outfight an entire empire. And perhaps most importantly, it taught a lesson that transcends war. Impossible odds are not truly impossible. They are merely odds that have not yet met a commander with the will to defy them. Today, the ruins of ancient Iconium lie beneath the modern city of Konya. Travelers can still walk the ground where Barbarossa made his legendary charge. They can touch the stones once guarded by the Seljuk garrison. But the true monument to the battle is not in the city's stones. It lies in the enduring truth that when leadership, discipline, and unwavering courage converge, even the most hopeless situation can be transformed into eternal victory. In 6 hours on a scorching day in 1190, Frederick Barbarossa reminded the world why the Iron Men of the West were feared from Scotland to Syria. He proved that strategy, determination, and the sheer force of human will could reshape history. And though the emperor drowned far from the glory he had earned, Iconium stands as his final roar, a blaze of triumph carved forever into the chronicles of war.